Follow the African in all of these areas is because Africa is a shattered world and its fragments are scattered all over this globe. It is therefore impossible to study Africa simply by looking at Africa itself. In fact, a lot of early Africa has disappeared and survives, in fact, in the life and civilization of other peoples. One is very much aware of this, for example, when one is in Brazil or in Haiti. I was in Brazil and in Haiti in 1981. In 1981, I was studying voodoo in Haiti, and I was particularly struck by the way in which various African elements that had entered voodoo had, as it were, dynamically intertwined with things that had happened in the New World, and yet it retained an African dimension. But no one in Africa itself, going into Dahomey, where Vodun originally originated, could actually study Vodun in all of its aspects without going to Haiti. The same thing I found in Brazil, that when I went into the temple of the great high priestess, black high priestess in Bahia, I was aware that there were Yoruba rituals in Brazil that preserved intact what had already been destroyed in Africa. So that in a world where a tremendous shattering has occurred, a cataclysm has occurred, a holocaust has occurred, a holocaust far more terrifying than the Jewish Holocaust, it is impossible to go back and find intact anywhere the cultural heritage of that world. You have got to go back through other places, other things, not only Africa itself. Hence the attempt to synthesize the African presence in the world by going through Europe, America, and Asia has been absolutely necessary. But this presents particular difficulty for any one person because no one scholar can master all three continents. Asia is the one I am weakest in. I spent 10.5 years in Europe. I spent time in Africa. I spent a great part of my life in North and South America. I've spent now almost as much time in North America as in South America. Asia is the only place I have never visited. And that is very strange because the radio in my country opens in the morning in Hindustani. I have lived in Hindu villages. Guyana is a very strange country, the land from which I come, because it's one of those few black-dominated countries in the world which has more Indians than Africans. 52% of my country is Indian, not American Indian, East Indians from Asia. And the curious thing was that the struggle we had at the beginning, and this is probably what led to my neglect of Asia, the struggle we had in the beginning, we fought very hard to weld the African and Indian population together because it is only by that unity that we felt we could defeat the British. As a result of which our party was composed of Africans and Indians. The Indian was the leader because the largest population was Indian. So our first prime minister was an Indian, Cheddi Jagan. And later on, when a struggle developed in the party, Jagan lost and Burnham, the black, became our prime minister and then president for life. At the moment, our prime minister is still black and our cabinet is composed of Indians, that is Asians and Africans. So that the Asian element is something very important in my personal life. But because it was the reason why I was sent into exile, it is something that part of me has tried to forget. Because after the tremendous attempt to weld the Asiatics and the Africans in my country, an attempt that failed when the British eventually imprisoned most of us, we had a civil war in which Africans killed hundreds of Indians and Indians killed hundreds of Africans. And at that point, just before the breakout, I was in information services. I was very much aware of what was going to happen. I had my fingers on the nerve of the country. I knew exactly what was going to happen, and I knew that if I stayed, I would be killed. And as a result of that, I left home, and even though I have returned at odd times, I was really thrown into permanent exile because of this feud between the Asian and African. If only we knew our history, If only we knew how linked we were. Not simply in the fact that we had a common enemy in the British, but if we only knew how profoundly the Asian and the African was linked, that kind of tragedy might have been averted. Because bear in mind that merely being black or being Indian doesn't mean that you have a sense of what it is to be black or what it is to be Asian. Our history, both the history of the Indian and the history of the African, was wiped out. Whenever you read the history of Africa, particularly when you go into these books, you will see what is sustained, almost desperate attempt to wipe out anything that is not European. This is all pervasive. In Asia, it is just as true as it is in Africa. In Asia, in fact, there has been a tremendous attempt to destroy the black. There are 100 million black people today in Asia. Most of you are not aware of that. 100 million blacks in Asia. And when I speak of Asia, it covers not only India, it goes into parts of Melanesia, it goes through the Pacific Islands, all of these places. And Asia covers a vast area. It covered the Mesopotamian world, the Euphrates Valley in early times. It covered a part of Ethiopia. It covered India, China, Japan, parts of Australia, etc. It is a vast world. Now, my expertise, as I say, has not been in Asia, but what I'm attempting to do tonight is to pull together the work of many authors. I have been extremely fortunate that in this one book I have been assisted by Ranoko Rashidi. This is the only book that I have co-edited with anyone. And it is a tremendous eye-opener because we become aware of the profound influence of Africa on every aspect of world civilization. Not only in Europe, Egyptians impacting on the Greeks, the Moors, Arab and African Moors impacting upon Europe at a later time, but the profound influence on India. The reason for that is that we have to understand that man was born in Africa. Now that in itself is not significant because people have used that against Africans. In fact, when I was going to university, everybody that I met, all of my professors believed man was born in Africa, but they said to me, and it was said in all the books, that man was born in Africa, and that is why Africans are primitive. That when the primitive African moved out into Europe and Asia, he became civilized, whereas those poor guys who remained back in Africa, they regressed. So the fact that man was born in Africa didn't help. What we have discovered recently, however, and the strange thing is that not we, but our enemies have discovered it, is that not only the first man was born in Africa, but the last man. And within the last 3 years have come out tremendous statements, very shattering, earth-shattering, very revolutionary, statements made by Oxford of all places, that they now have proof. As a result of the ability to study mitochondrial DNA in the blood, they now have proof that all man now living on the earth is murdered by one black woman. And that it's not just the first man, because there are 6 stages of man, but the last advanced man on earth was an African, and that the European, the Asiatic, and the African are all anatomically African. They're only superficially pink or superficially brown or superficially having different hair textures, etc. But the brain of man on this planet and the organs of man on this planet are African. It's very important because that is a major distinction. It's not just a question of man born in Africa. Monkeys were born in Africa too. And that is in fact what people tell you when I was in university. So what? Okay, so that is very important to understand that, because real man as we know him today, appears in Africa about 150,000 years ago. Hominids, that is man-like creatures, appear 3.5 million years ago. But real man, modern man, with the brain case we have now, only appears about 140 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. Then he comes to Europe. There are no Europeans. Africans people Europe. They invade Europe. You can't call it an invasion because there was nobody there except apes. Okay, and Neanderthal man, which was another stage of African man, which was not yet fully developed. The final fully developed man, which we call the Grimaldi, entered Europe, they say about 55,000 years ago. And then undergoes a change which takes about 10,000 years in ice, when he begins to drop pigmentation and he begins to operate in the ice, first being an albino type and then stabilizing in the ice. Then the Asiatic is a result of a later migration, with migration from Africa nevertheless going into West Asia and spreading out, going up into China and Japan. You find in fact that this story will not only touch on India, it will also touch on China, it will touch on Arabia, and it will touch on one or two other places. The movement into Asia is tremendously important because we find that whenever we go back into Asian history, the great civilizations, the Indus Valley civilizations, are Africoid. Now, when they found these skeletons and skulls, there were all sorts of names for them. Let me give you a few of the names, because that is one of the things that was done in Egypt, that when they found the Egyptians, they said they were brown Mediterraneans. They created races for the Egyptians, when in fact, as Diop showed, if you were to take the skulls of the Egyptians and you were to measure it against the skulls in African graves, West or Central Africa, it's the same skulls. But because it was not classically Negroid, all of them, what they call the classical Negro, as Diop shows, there's a range of what we call the Negroid or the Africoid. Let's use the term Africoid. When they make this comparison, they are embarrassed. So they have Chatterjee and Kumar, two Indian archaeologists, discovered that the Indians, the early Indians, are the same as the Nubians 5,000 years ago. Well, nobody has any doubt of who the Nubians were 5,000 years ago. They were all black people. Look what the various anthropologists said. Sergi says, these are the same skulls, you know, looking exactly like the Nubians 5,000 years, that they're Mediterranean. Bosch says they're Hamitic. Elliot Smith said they're Proto-Egyptian. Deere said they are Iranic. Fisher said they are Oriental. Lebzetzer said they are Nordoid. I never heard that one before. And Erstedt said they are Indidi, Eastern Mediterranean, or indeed. Now all of this because they cannot face the black. Because they call themselves Indo-Aryan. Therefore, if the Indian has something to do with them, the black couldn't be in there too. I mean, that's a double embarrassment. It's enough to find the black pushing his head up into Europe, being father of the Caucasoid, and then you go to Asia where they were searching for man until yesterday, and then at the bottom, at the very ground floor of the race, you find another African. So you have, that's the search for name. They're finding all sorts of names to explain this. They can't say European because they know it's not European, so they have to find a name: Hamitic, Iranic, Nordoid, indeed, Mediterranean, Iranic, all sorts of things to escape that fact. Now, why is it important? It is important because you see, the early Africoid Asiatics in India had established an extraordinary civilization. It is known as the Indus Valley civilization. We have found two of the great cities. They are almost twin cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. And those cities astonish us. We discover, for example, that although they are 4,000 years old, the cities are built with the same grid-like pattern as Manhattan. The streets are structured like Manhattan. They find also that most of the people lived in 2- and 3-story houses, and that they had these beautiful courtyards, gracious large rooms, on a great central courtyard, and their windows opened on this courtyard. And then they found something which was unknown in Europe until very, very much later. They all had baths with drains leading to central sewage system. They had something which I don't know anyone in this room had. They had trash chutes that would take the trash down through tunnels and send them out into the central sewage system. They had their own private wells. Every house had its own private wells for fresh water. They had shipping docks with sluice gates unknown in the world at that time. Sluice gates that they could, so that whether it was low tide or high tide, they could bring the ships in because they were involved in intensive and extensive trading. All of these things. And this they had for some time until a people, fair-skinned people, nomadic people, described by them as savage people, came in. These are the people who were to call themselves Aryans, and everywhere they conquered, they were to call it Aryavata, the land of the whites. Okay? And they attacked these people whom they call the Dasas, the Dacias or the Dasas, whom they described as dark, bull-lipped, and snub-nosed. Now, this battle went on for a long time, because even though, and this is something that a lot of people don't seem to understand, they think that because a country or a nation or a people are defeated, it means a superior people has defeated them. That is not true. Genghis Khan was not superior to the people he defeated. Certainly not. Genghis Khan's vast hordes ranged wild, smashing everything before it. He was a barbarian. A barbarian is more likely to succeed than a civilized person, because a civilized person may pause. They may have a certain morality. They may wonder about whether they should kill or not kill. But if you're mad or barbaric, you pause at nothing. The most successful invaders are those who are savage. They don't even know what civilization is. The Persians, for example, on the Cambyses smashed everything, erased everything to the ground, all the statues, all the temples, all the palaces, all the beautiful things that were built were razed to the ground. Same way the Aryans went marching through, smashing everything. The slaughters were tremendous. They found the skeletons, masses of skeletons, butchered with their heads cut off and legs and arms. This is thousands of years later we have found these skeletons. So you can understand the kind of rage and savagery of these nomads sweeping across into India. Now, it was not only in these Indus Valley civilizations that you have the movement of the Great Black. The Great Black is also found in Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia, which is referred to as Babylon, etc. in the Bible, is not a black place. It has a major black element. It has Asiatics, it has blacks. It may also have a few Europeans, but the black emerged there with great force, because we have evidence. For example, when we go to cities, there are, Mesopotamia has great cities. Sumer, Elam, Susa, etc. have very great cities. And when we go to these great cities, we have found evidence of a major black presence. Like, for example, the governor, Gudea. And by the way, you will see some slides at the end of this talk. I do not have them all, unfortunately. You must get the book. All the things I talk about here today, and all the pictures, not only the slides you see, but far more than those slides, are found in the book. But in Sumer, it was dominated by people who call themselves the Blackheads. Now listen to this. They call themselves the Blackheads. You know what the European historian said? The reason why they call themselves the Blackheads is because they had black hair. Now all the people had black hair. This was not a European country. You could go right across India, you could go right across China. Almost everybody has black hair. So why would somebody pick out that as a title? And then these people built a tremendous civilization there. We have this Governor Goudet who is extremely powerful. And we find that he was able to do extraordinary things there. He built a great city there. And then it was attacked eventually. The blacks were eventually attacked by the Aryans. Now this is the first meeting recorded between whites and blacks. This is what the blacks say of the whites at that stage. The Martu who know no grain, they're not cultivators yet. The Martu who know no house or town, the Boers of the mountains, they're nomads. The Martu who does not bend to cultivate the land, who eats raw meat, who has no house during his lifetime, who is not buried after his death. Because most of the Europeans did not bury because they were running from place to place. Africans, in fact, the Grimaldi were the first to introduce burial of humans in Europe. Because those before them, like the Neanderthals who were not complete, and then the later nomadic tribes in Europe, they burnt things. They burnt, or they just threw it away, or they burnt the bodies, but they did not build graves. The Grimaldi were the first to build graves in Europe. Now this thrust of the Aryan was something that was fantastic, because the Indus Valley civilizations suffered such a tremendous blow. Because the Europeans then introduced the caste system. A lot of people think the caste system was introduced by Indians, by indigenous Asiatics. No, the caste system was introduced by the Aryans. Aryans have their sacred texts. They introduced Sanskrit. They developed Sanskrit and they made sacred poems. And they decided that God had told them that man was divided into various castes. And those people who were white would be the top caste, the Brahmins, the fair-skinned ones, okay? And down the ladder that you go, you have, for example, let me give you the run-through. There is the Brahmins, and then there's the Kshatriyas, the red ones, okay, the Kshatriyas, who probably Eurasian. And they are the warrior caste, and they also involve military and political administrators. Then under them come the Vaishyas. No, the Kshatriyas are warriors, the Vaishyas are military and political administrators. Then come the blacks, the Sudras. And then below the blacks come the untouchables. The untouchables are those who are mixed breeds. Mixed breeds are considered to be the lowest. Like if somebody who is a Brahmin sleeps with a Sudra, produces an untouchable, because you're not supposed to mix races and bloods, okay? Now, could you understand what a terrible thing happened to the untouchable? Let me read to you something about the untouchable that is really quite extraordinary, what was done to people who were considered to be untouchables. The life of the Indian untouchable was full of misery and impoverishment. Food and drink, if seen by them, were not to be taken. Generally, they lived in settlements on the outskirts of villages and towns. In certain periods in Indian history, outcasts or untouchables were not allowed to enter the community at night. In other periods, they were not even allowed to enter in daylight. Indeed, the outcast's very shadow was considered polluting. Outcasts were required to attach a broom to their backs so as to erase any evidence of their presence as they walked. Can you imagine that? They had to clean the place where they walked with the broom. A cup was tied around their necks to capture any spit that might escape their lips. The sole untouchable possessions consisted of dogs and donkeys. Their meals were consumed from broken dishes. Their clothing was taken from corpses. The principal functions of the outcasts included street sweeping, the removal of dead animals and human corpses, and the cleanup of cremation grounds. All of it was regarded as impure. Now, Rashidi, who co-edited this book with me, went to India and headed a conference with the untouchables. The untouchables, by the way, in India, find great strength from us. They associate themselves with us. They cried to us. Rajshekar, who is in this book, talked about the terrible plight of the untouchables in India. He says it is worse than South Africa. Of course, one of the things that I must point out, I have not been to modern India, as I say. Well, I must point out, though, that Gandhi made a tremendous effort to redeem this. So did Nehru. So that with respect to education, for example, they made places for untouchables to make up for the tremendous injustice that had been done to them in the way they make quotas for blacks here in this country. Now, however, one of the things that helped more than anything else is the emergence of extraordinary men who fought for the untouchables. One of such men was Buddha. Buddha belonged to a black sect in India. All the pictures, all the great early pictures of Buddha are of black. In Greece, he looks like a Greek because the Greeks made things look the way they wanted them to look. Just as in later days, people were to make Christ look the way they wanted him to look. But Buddha attracted a great number of people because of his revolt and rebellion against the social order. I want you to note that, because people do not become prophets merely because they jump up and say things. Anybody could say anything. The easiest thing to say is a platitude, a religious platitude. That is not what makes prophets. Prophets are people who are deeply involved with the people. Jesus was. Whether we believe in him or not, or whether we part of the Christian faith or not, that is a man who, like Buddha, risked his life on the line. He did not play. He wasn't just talking, and many attempts were made to get him because they actually wanted him killed, not simply imprisoned but killed. That is why they sent people out asking questions like, Master, if Caesar says we must pay taxes, should we pay taxes? Now, if Jesus had said, no, don't pay Caesar taxes, that he would have been executed. And at the same time, if he said, pay Caesar taxes, a lot of people would go away and say, look, we thought this was the Messiah. He was coming to help poor people, and he's telling us, pay the taxes. So Jesus said very cleverly, give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God. Everywhere they tried to trap him, he would spin out of their grasp until finally, when he had already completed what he thought was his mission, eventually they closed in on him. And even then, it was difficult because the Romans, the whites, who didn't know what all this fuss was about because they wondered what this strange man was about. Christianity had not yet come to Europe. They did not know what was going on. All they knew was that, look, I am Pontius Pilate, I'm in charge of this region, and I don't want any great fuss with the Jews because these Jews seem to be controlling a great part of the population. Let me compromise with them. But why do you want to kill this man? And when Pontius Pilate examined Jesus, he said, look, I have found this man innocent. Here is Barabbas. And the Jews said, no, we don't want Barabbas. We want Jesus. And eventually he was executed. The same thing occurred in many contexts. You have these extraordinary figures. And one of the most extraordinary things in the world is that these figures occurred 600 years apart. Exactly 600 years apart. Krishna, the black Christ in Asia, and you will see his black figure here in this book. Krishna, who is known as the Black Christ in India, appeared in 1200 BC. Jesus does not appear until 1200 years later. Buddha appears 600 years exactly after Krishna. And Christ appears, Jesus, the Christ, appears exactly 600 years after Buddha. Now, the curious thing is that with respect to Buddha, apart from the fact that he was born from a virgin, they say, and the name of the virgin was Maya, which is close to Mary. But Krishna is extraordinary. Listen to this. Krishna has parallels with Jesus which are really quite extraordinary. Krishna, for example, was born of a virgin. Krishna, when he was being born, his father was paying taxes in the city, exactly what Joseph was doing when Jesus was born. When Krishna was born, they said there was a light in the heavens. Some star became very bright. The same thing happened in the time of Jesus. When Krishna died, he was 33. Jesus died at 33. Krishna grew up in a village called Mathura. Jesus grew up in a village in Egypt called Mataria. When Krishna was about to be born, an angel announced his coming. When Jesus was about to be born, an angel announced his coming. You have all of these incredible parallels. Now, some people have seen that, like John Jackson, who mentioned some of these parallels as evidence that Jesus did not exist. It is just the old story told again. Jesus did exist. There is a very great ground for the historicity of Jesus. What you're having here, what is happening here, is that on the historical figures, people invest various things. They place myth upon the historical figure. Also, if you really believe that there is such a thing as a supernatural appearance or supernatural presence in man, now some of us believe that and some of us don't, okay, then there is no mystery, because why shouldn't he come back again in different places? Why should he go to one place? Why shouldn't he appear in other places in other forms? But I don't want to take that line, because as a scholar I can't. I have to take the line that the evidence before us shows that you're dealing with the real man in Jesus, because even though there are duplicatable dramas in the life, his sayings are not duplicatable. Jesus has an individual lightning. He says things that have never been said before in that way, and enters the world in circumstances and goes through various intrigues with a body of people. And this is recorded so well by so many people, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that you cannot be dealing with a pure fiction. It is not possible, because it's not just the mythological elements which could have been planted later, but you have the real nitty-gritty life, day-to-day life, friends, disciples, people, statements, sayings, actions, which are not duplicated by Krishna or anyone else. So that even though there may be a spirit at work in the world that may take on certain forms that have duplicatable elements, you are dealing still, therefore, with a very real man. Now, the extraordinary thing, as I say, is that these men appear always among the poor, always among those who are beaten down, always among those who are oppressed. It is as if the spirit, the brightest light of the human spirit only appears in the darkness of the world. Okay, that is something that should give one hope, because it is when one is truly oppressed that the light burns. It does not burn in absolute brightness. If it did, we would not even see it. The presence of these figures, Buddha, for example, you can find Buddhas with the broad nose, the full lips, and the texture of hair of the African right across the world, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in many islands of the Pacific, in India, in China, etc. The blacks have been to China too, and one of the most extraordinary stories about China is that the first emperor of China, listen to this, this is as early as 2,953 years before Christ. This is about nearly 5,000 years ago. The first emperor of China is recorded as a man with dark skin and woolly hair. His name is Fu Hsi, Fu-HSI. He reigns from 2953 to 2838 BC. He is considered to be a divine black in China. You rarely hear about that. He was not just the only major black. There's a whole dynasty of Chinese that are black. It's known as the Shang dynasty. Okay, and they're actually called Na Ki. Na means black in Chinese, and Ki means man. Na Ki, black man. The Shang dynasty, a line of very great kings in China, are all black. They are recorded, it's 1786 or 1766 rather, to 1110 years before Christ, which is going back close to 4,000 years. And they were also referred to by the Chu who conquered them as very black men. Okay, so that you have this black element which still survived, even though other elements came in, like for example the black underwent changes in China, the epicantic fold, etc. The original people of the world in different ecological zones underwent different kinds of superficial changes. But you have this survival of the black in various places. In China, for example, one of the things, and it's unfortunate we don't have that slide with us here, but it's in the book, you will find karate in Egypt. It is carved out on temples in Egypt. A man called Kalindi Ai has done a lot of work on this, showing the postures, the holds, the throws, which later appear in some of the Chinese and Japanese forms of combat. He shows this among the Egyptians. Now, we do not know to what extent, without a comparative combat technique, whether these are independent systems or whether the one influenced the other, whether the Egyptian may have influenced the Chinese. We cannot say that with certainty. But we do know that the Egyptians, like the Chinese, had looked closely at animals, how they fought, and how they could fight without weapons, which only man has, and that how they were able to transform this into an art of self-defense even when one did not have weapons. We've also followed the black in Arabia, and that is one of the most extraordinary stories. Today, unfortunately, you have many of the Arabs who in Egypt and some other places who may speak of their brotherhood with blacks, but who would not like to be associated with a black ancestry. I found this when my wife and I were in Egypt this summer. I was aware of that before I went to Egypt, of course, because all my reading showed me that, and I remembered some years ago when Sheikh Anta Diop, the late Sheikh Anta Diop, and I were talking to the Egyptians over the telephone, trying to push them into pressuring the British to give them back the splinters of the Sphinx nose. They don't want to do that, and I hope that they don't do it by themselves, because that nose is going to look real funny when they're finished with it. I don't know how they're going to get around that, because the structure of the face makes it difficult for them to reconstruct that with a falsehood without altering some other part. We found that in America, for example, where they altered a stela that was standing there with full lips and a certain texture of hair, and the nose had been slightly broken, and they recarved a straight nose, aquiline nose, and it didn't go along with the lip, so they cut the lip. We saw that also, some of you seen on television, where they go down into some of the tombs and temples and they're repainting things. They're putting on paint to make it look a little fairer, saying they're reconstructing things. I saw recently a Life magazine having the Egyptian. Now, since they found so many dark Egyptians, what they do is they darken the face, but they put an aquiline nose, and when you see the hair, that is so interesting. When you see the hair, when the picture is close up, you see it's African hair. But when it's a figure in the background, you see that it's a Bauderic thing, or somebody making up their hair in a certain way. When we were in Egypt, my wife and I, we were photographing the wigs Now that is a very telling thing. There's two things that takes you right through the falsehood: hair and skin. And Africans are the only people who have preserved in mummification their hair and skin for thousands of years. You can still take off, in spite of the fact that they destroyed thousands of mummies, you can still take off the bandage and see black faces. We have Anutawi, for example, an African woman who died 4,000 years ago. You can see her teeth. You can see the covers on her eyes. I thought for a moment that one of her eyes were open, but you could at least see the covers on her eyes, and the balls are full against the eyes. You can see the skin. You can see the hair. It looked like if she died yesterday. And the hair, the wigs. We were photographing the wigs for more than half an hour because these wigs are so clearly African. And this gentleman walked up to me, Arab, walked into me almost. Do you have a permit for your camera? And I said, of course. May I see it, please? I showed it to him. And is she using a video camera? Pointing to my wife, I said, first of all, if she was, she would have a permit for it. And secondly, she is not. May I see her camera, please? So we showed him the camera. He went looking at it, and then he gave it back. I'm sorry, I just want you to know I'm the curator of the Cairo Museum. And I almost shouted, big deal! Because he was disturbed for two reasons. One, he knows that when people pay that close attention, they're not fools. And secondly, he has not catalogued in the Cairo Museum catalog those wigs. It's not in the catalog. It's under the title something about a lion's mane or some nonsense like that. It is absurd that these and the mummies. The other telling piece of evidence, we can't see the mummies. They said Sadat, and we can't ask Sadat because he's not around. That Sadat said that it's humiliating to watch these mummies. It's disgraceful to watch these dead people, and also their germs. Imagine germs coming thousands of years ago to hit us. Now I say this because I want you to be aware the same thing is happening in relation to ancient India. And it was very refreshing for Rashidi to meet Ratchakar and the Untouchables. Do you know what they named themselves? Dalit Panther. Because of their memory of the Panther Party. They look, you do not know how many people look to us here. That's why we have a tremendous responsibility. You do not know how many Africans, West Indians, and Indians look to blacks in America for leadership. We would not have our Prime Minister, we would not have had our break against the British were not our Prime Minister educated in this country, politicized. The breakthrough in Ghana would not have occurred if Nkrumah had not come here. When I came here, I was still using the word Negro. I didn't even suspect it had a social connotation that was disgraceful or humiliating. Because in spite of our revolutionary trend, our final education was here. And it had to do with the spirit of the people here. So do not misunderstand the importance of that struggle. It's not just here in America that struggle has significance. When you sit in Africa far away, especially in Southern Africa, but even in West Africa, people are hoping that something happens here. Wherever I went in the world, for example, within the past year, even in Egypt, people would come up to you and say, what is Jesse doing? That's in Egypt. They are absolutely fascinated. They want it because that struggle is theirs too. They know that if that black image changes, it changes them. And I say it's tragic that my people, the Indians and the Africans in my country, could not see that common thread that bound them. before the attack of the Aryans. That attack was to make a tremendous difference because it did introduce, as Ratchakar says, it did introduce the caste system, and it made it binding because they said it was religious. God came and told them that they should cut society into these castes. The untouchables, as I say, there's been some improvement, at least that's what I was told in the time of Gandhi and Nehru, but Ratchakar says that improvement is not enough. They're still within a trap. Now we go to Arabia, and that is what brought me into the question of Egypt. Early Arabia was completely black. This is because the Arabian thing is tremendously significant. The Arabian world, for example, produced two scripts. It produced the Himyaritic script, it produced Arabic script. As Drusilla Dungy Houston, who wrote the book on Ethiopians, she has pointed to the fact that the Himyaritic script was created by the Africans in that early Arabia. And Abul Aswan, note this, Abul Aswan is recorded in the diaries of Ibn Khalikan, page 662, that he, the African, invented the Arabic script. So that early Arabic language and its later script was influenced by the African. And it is true that, like with the Jews, though originally largely African, you have the Semitization, people coming in from Asiatic world and transforming Arabia, so that by the time of Muhammad only 10% of Arabia was black. Now some people have claimed, like Uthman Amir ibn Bihar al-Jahazi, that Muhammad was of African lineage. I have no proof of that. What we do know is that his right-hand man, Bilal, was an African, and he is known as the third pillar of the faith. It is very important because most of the great religions, all in fact, Buddha, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, even Judaism has its roots in Africa. It's very important to note that, because even though the Arabs, as I say, were later to become Semitized, they were still close enough to the African that in later times, like in the times of the Moors, they merged with the African. And in spite of the prejudice that exists among some of them, it must be pointed out that they, although they have been accused of savage slavery, and there are many incidents of this, sometimes what is regarded as slavery is far different from the slavery in Anglo-American context. Because Graham Irwin, a professor on Asia, has pointed out that they had a custom, many Muslims had a custom of calling a person a slave if they were foreigners serving them. For example, they would invite a foreigner to become a general in the army because they may be afraid that their own people might revolt against them, so they want their people to be under a foreigner. He would be called a slave, although he's the general of the army. The palace guard, the most trusted people around a king, would usually be black. They would be called slaves. The major administrative posts, sometimes as high as Secretary of the State, in one case a prime minister, he was called a slave, but he was in charge. Well, I don't mind being called a slave if I'm in charge. You found caliphs of Baghdad, black caliphs of Baghdad. So in spite of all that may be said about the Arab, I do not know of any European instance where the caliph who's in head is black. So obviously there was a different kind of system and a different kind of approach. You find, for example, the Mughals of India, who made the cities admirals. They were put in charge of the ocean. These are black people. They were so respected for their seafaring skills, the cities, that they were made admirals of the Indian Ocean. And the caliph, imagine caliphs, there were at least 2 caliphs of Baghdad, which is a central thing in the Muslim world, were black. And you have this opening, this fluidity within the so-called slave system for people to emerge who become tremendously important. One of these people is Malik Ambar. Malik Ambar was a slave. He came to India as a slave. Eventually, he got his freedom because his master was so impressed by his ability. He built his own army. He started out as a great trader. Eventually, he became the power behind the throne. As powerful as the prime minister himself, he actually sent his own African ambassador to Arabia, to the courts of Arabia. He encouraged manufactures. He built canals. He built mosques. He developed a postal service. And he was able to support poets and scholars from the treasury. That was the remarkable thing about him. And he had the air of the most powerful people in India. Also, he developed a land policy that allowed for both private and public ownership. This is the kind of extraordinary types of people who emerge. In China, one of the emperors and a whole dynasty of kings, black. In Japan, where they pointed out that in order to be truly brave, there's a particular sect in Japan. And in order to belong to that select sect, you must have black blood. In India, among the Mughals, you find this. In China, we have found several black noblemen who are major figures in the early Chinese court. We've also found some extraordinary blacks in Russia, which cannot be accounted for. Like, for example, there's a major figure which you will see in one of the slides that are found in Russia. In Arabia, we find the greatest hero of Arabia is a man called Antar. He was a great poet and a great adventurer. He became a legend in Arabia and is seen in many of the tales. This is a black African. You find also the black in Sumer and Elam. This is very important because these were major Mesopotamian dynasties. These were major city-states in Mesopotamia. In Elam, for example, the archaeologist Dula Foy discovered that when they went, although they thought it was purely Asiatic or Euro-Asian, when they went down and they dug up, they found the friezes with totally black faces with African features. They found shows that where the tops were broken or smashed, they found the feet were black. So that wherever you go, they have found this figure. Now, the change that this could bring about is something that I want to dwell on. I have been really speaking in the last 3 lectures of the 3 areas that have to be explored: Europe, America, Asia. And I want to close by pulling some of these things together. In Europe, we talked about the Egyptians. We cannot go over again evidence to establish the blackness of the Egyptians. The evidence is overwhelming. The early Egyptians, the early Egyptians, the Egyptians of the pyramids, the Egyptians who were to have such a profound impact on Greece. European civilization in the early stages, particularly the Greeks, could not have become what it became without the impact of the black. And it didn't stop there. It was to have, the blacks were to have an enormous impact along with the Arabs or Arabian type in Europe of the Moors. Those 4 Muslim dynasties, that's why Muslims are hated so much by the Europeans. Because those Muslim dynasties, the Almoravid and Almohade and Abbasid, and the Umayyad dynasties, those dynasties left a tremendous mark on Europe. They introduced the blacks, and the Arabs introduced windmills into Europe. They introduced silk industry into Europe. They introduced the cotton industry into Europe. They introduced strawberries and lemons and grapes and all sorts of exotic fruit into Europe. They introduced air conditioning into Europe, perfumed air conditioning. They were the first paved streets in Europe were paved by the Moors. The first streets lighted in Europe were lighted by the Moors. They introduced trigonometry into Europe, just as earlier the Egyptians introduced geometry into Europe. They introduced algebra into Europe. They introduced optics into Europe, the first experiments with eyeglasses and experiments that were to lead to the camera were introduced by the blacks and the Arabs in Europe. And out here in America, long, long before slavery, blacks were here. I was called to Congress last year, and that was quite a surprise to me, because I thought that all my enemies had pounded at me long enough for me to have vanished from consideration. But I got this letter, first a phone call, that they wanted me to appear before Congress, a congressional committee, because 1992 would be the quincentenary of Columbus's discovery of America. And they wanted to know what I had to say about that. They wanted to give me the democratic right to discuss this matter. And one of the reasons was that they wanted to look very closely at what this Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Committee was doing. So the congressional committee that called me was the one that was overseeing the finances they would give out to this Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Committee and how they could advise them or restrict them. So I was called to give this talk, and I remember coming into that chamber, and of course everybody had prepared speeches. There are very few people who speak like me. You just get up and you talk. Everybody has their little piece of paper and they're reading it. Cliche after cliche after cliche, nothing jumping out of themselves. It's all well prepared and beautifully typed up. And I remember this gentleman in particular, he had a nice little page in his hand. He even had it, he even had it well in a beautiful little file. And he came up to me and he said, I hear that you believe that there were Africans in America before Columbus. I said, yes, I not only believe it, I could prove it. You're not serious, are you? And I said, I'm dead serious. I'm more serious than you are. And he went back to his seat, because I certainly looked at him with a very stern face, so there was no need for further conversation. So he went back to his seat, and then after I was allowed 15 minutes. Well, you know, I can't talk in 15 minutes about something, but I spoke for half an hour. Nobody stopped me. And when I was finished, the chairman said that in the light of this, I was asked a number of questions. I was asked, for example, about the Caribbean. Should the celebrations just restrict itself to this one island where Columbus said he had landed first? And there was a discussion about that. And then there was a discussion about the fact that my speech aroused suspicions about the commission. So they asked them, how many blacks are on this commission that is celebrating this marvel? No blacks. How many Native Americans? No native. Could you imagine that? The Native American created the country. The blacks were dragged here to build it. And they're going to celebrate America, the discovery of America. And there are no blacks and Native Americans on their commission. Well, that really put them on a hot spot. And then the chairman went forward and said, in the light of this testimony, it is quite clear that there were people who visited the Native Americans before Columbus, and we should not refer to this as a discovery, but merely as a voyage of exploration, as a contact. Okay, I saw later on a certain gentleman in the New York Times at the front page saying, perhaps Columbus was not the first to come to America, but he was the first to go back and give a press conference. Well, I'm glad at least I could reduce them to that triviality. Now, those of you who are interested in that, by the way, there's a special tape, Van Sertima Before Congress. It's recorded. The whole session, not just my speech, but the whole congressional session is recorded, and it's available tonight. But the American thing is very significant because we have come here and we have lived here for centuries believing that our history begins in 1492. That's an awful burden. I know when I was in England, I heard my friends telling me, we have to face it, Van, we have to start from scratch. Could you imagine that? We, with all this history, have to start from scratch? But they really believe that there is no real internal power. There is no dimension to us if we believe we have to start from scratch. This history is what gives us a power, a spiritual power. There is nothing more important than that. When all the chips are down, there are certain people in the world who had nothing but the spiritual power, the belief in self, and they were able to transform great tragedy because of that. That history gives us that. And the reason why we seek it out in Europe, out in Asia, out in America, is because we are a shattered diamond. Our pieces are all over the place. And we can never feel whole again. We can never feel a sense of completeness and wholeness again until we can pull all of these threads and strands together. That is our mission. That is our hope. That is the great dream of our life. That we will one day be able, through this history, through this knowledge of history, through this immersion in history, to bring back the African in us out from the exploded fragments into a sense of a new nucleus. That new nucleus can lead to the birth of a different kind of man and a different kind of world. Thank you very much.
Okay, brothers and sisters, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Before you, Dr. Van Sertima has agreed to answer some question and answers for about 5 minutes. But before we get into that, I want to remind you that if you are eating or in your place, just do us a favor and pick up your refuse on your way out. And there's a garbage pail back there, or just take it to the back table. Remind you about next week, our tribute to our black veterans. Remind you to keep in mind the many things that Reverend Dorchy told you about the plans that we have for 89. And especially I want to remind the brothers, we're not excluding the sisters, but this is something that we have put together for the brothers. We call it a unity breakfast. And we furnish the breakfast. Good old down-home breakfast. Now, those of you who don't know what a good old down-home breakfast is, let me tell you. You know, biscuits, and grits, and for those of you who eat meat, sausages. Those of you who like the pig, might have a little bacon, but we'll have some beef patties, and we're going to do the cooking, and we'll have it down here, and we're looking to have a guest speaker. This is a means that we have started before. This is a means for us, the brothers, to get together, to sit down, and put our minds together to see what we can do to help each other to build a nation within a nation. Every other ethnic group has its support system. When you go across the Brooklyn Bridge, you see Chinatown. And if you go to the right, you're in Little Italy. And if you go up a little further on the east side, it's Irish section and the German section, and etc. and etc. If we were attacked, or if people came after, they're coming after us in ones. But what happens if they come at us in bunches? What do we do and where do we go? But we need to sit down and talk about some economics. The economics that Marcus Garvey spoke about. The economics that Malcolm spoke about. And I believe the integration that Dr. King was talking about was not about us leaving our communities, but that we had the right to go where we wanted to, but to build our own institutions, our own places of business, put our own brothers to work, our children to work. Right now, our universities are training our young people in black universities to work for Fortune 500. There's nothing being said about going out to business yourself. Most of us who work here or here work make millions of dollars a year for the corporations that we work for. Why can't we do that for ourselves? So we're asking you, the brothers, we'll give you the date. It's going to be in February, but I'm letting you know now. And we're asking each brother to bring at least one young brother, any age, from a toddler on up. And let us sit down and let's start talking real business. Let's not talk about what should be done, but let's talk about what we can do together. It can be done, it must be done, and we here at APCO, the brotherhood of this church, the House of the Lord Church, the leader of this church, Reverend Daughtry, the sisters of this church, we are determined that 89 is going to be a year that the brother stands up. Like Rosa Parks, when she sat down, the movement got up. We need to do the same thing, and we can do it. I thank you. Now we're going to ask that you do questions, but please, please, we've had a lecture. This is the lecture. You know, and he comes and honorarium, and this is his business. You know, if you're not a musician, you're not going to understand with Count Basie's orchestra. So just ask the question and do not make any statements, please. Anyone that has a question, just please stand where you're at. And I'm sorry we don't have the extra mic tonight, and just kind of throw your voice out with the question. Brother back here.
I don't think the Arab problem is as great as the problem in South Africa. All peoples in the world are prejudiced against Africans. That is quite understandable, because even we have been trained to be prejudiced against Africans. Until the knowledge, okay, you see, that is the thing that you must bear in mind, okay. For example, it is Arabs who invited me to join UNESCO in order to help rewrite African history. Don't misunderstand, therefore, what this means. You cannot wipe out within a generation or two prejudice in the world, because wherever you go, that prejudice exists. It's a matter of degree. The Arabs are prepared, just as Malcolm X discovered, that in spite of the fact that some of them may hold on to this prejudice, they are prepared to work with Africans. Some of them are even prepared, under new circumstances, to actually give money to African states out of their oil fields. The Arab world at the moment is in a tremendous mess, as you know. There's big fighting between brother and brother. So that my talking about the prejudice that exists in the modern Egyptian and not wanting to be black, that is not a serious, okay, because all of that guy was doing was strutting around. He couldn't strike me. He couldn't do me anything. In fact, I could do him more damage than he could do me. But if I were in South Africa and that guy came up to me, that would have been it. Okay, so that don't exaggerate the things. It's not the same thing. We have friends, or rather we have people we can turn into friends. Okay, so that even though that prejudice exists, it's not on the same level. You see, prejudice may exist on a certain level, but it may not be translated into a powerful stick and gun as it is in South Africa. You know, there you have a very serious, painful thing. So it's still the central thing in the world. We don't have any more quarrel with the Arabs than with any other people, so that in certain circumstances the Arab will bend. Some of them may contain the prejudices, because you see, the Arab world is confused. It is not one world. Like, for example, Muhammad had to caution certain Arabs against discriminating against blacks, but the Arabs discriminated more against whites than blacks. The first people the Arabs enslaved were the whites. Okay, the Arab got into the slave. That's why the word slave is SLA, Slav. Okay, it is a European word. It's not an African word. The Arabs, for example, took thousands of European women and turned them into slaves. Okay, so that you have to understand that. And when they came into Africa, the first thing they did was to marry African women. They didn't have that prejudice in the same way. So these are fluid situations. They can go any way. It is up to us to give them a certain direction. When Malcolm X went to the Arab world, they worshipped him. Many of them, they were willing to open palaces to him. I mean, many of the kings and big powers opened their doors to him. Whatever kind of prejudice some of them may have had, that didn't stop them from doing that. You think Malcolm X could walk into South Africa and they open a door? They would shoot him down. So that is why I warn you that, I mean, even though these things exist, they exist at different levels. Okay. Yes? Go ahead. I don't follow. What are you asking?
I'm asking, like, all over the world, throughout the most recent history, we have participated in language colonization.
Language, linguistic, yeah.
So we have defined ourselves out of position.
Yeah.
We participated in the cause of South Africa, apartheid. We don't call it the fascist government of South Africa. We call it apartheid. But the invaders.
I don't think that changing the words around are going to make much difference. You see, while that may affect some people, the vast numbers of people don't really care what the thing is called. If something is racist, it doesn't matter whether it is fascist racist or racist fascist, okay? Words mean a lot, yes, but after a while something is so evil, it doesn't really matter what you call it. Okay, whether you call this a democracy, that's a linguistic falsification. Okay, if you want to call it so, but what does it matter? I mean, you know what you're fighting, you know the horror that is South Africa. It doesn't really matter, therefore, if you change the word from apartheid to fascist, it would not make the slightest difference. We're not going to go to the barricades any faster. We're not going to help the South African anymore. We're not going to get more intensely involved in the struggle. All of us are aware that we are dealing with a great evil in South Africa. It is the greatest evil in the modern world. So I don't think that if we escape from a linguistic class, imagine us sitting down now and planning sessions for the next few years, finding what word to call it, and to get all of us to agree when we could use all of that energy fighting it, not only there but even among ourselves. Okay, I don't disagree with the linguistic problem, but it doesn't help. It uses up energy. Yes.
I was doing some research about Asia, and I wonder if you was aware of the Kassites who had the longest dynasty in Babylon.
The Kassites.
And they were related as far as in the territory in Mesopotamia to Colossians in Russia.
Colchians, yeah.
I was wondering if you was aware that the Kassites were a black dynasty as well. About Asia, the Sumerians, the philology particularly to the Bantu language, and more particularly the Zulu language. I was wondering if you was aware of that.
Yeah, that is very new. You should write a note about it and show your sources. That is very new. We know that the Sumerian language is considered still to be a Semitic type language. If you can show valid sources to show that it is related to Bantu, you would have made a significant contribution. I've never heard of that. Okay. Yeah.
My question is in reference to an article that appeared in the Science Times section of the New York Times on November 8, 1988. And the title is Scholars Track the Alphabet with New Precision. And the article discusses the symposium held at the Institute of Semitic Studies at Princeton, New Jersey. And they talk about the origin of the modern-day alphabet from the Phoenicians. And to quote a few lines in the article, it says that Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BC, wrote that the knowledge of writing was brought to Greece by the Phoenicians by a legendary person known as Cadmus. And the one comment in the article that kind of struck me was how they said that the ancient Egyptians began using symbols for sounds, and most of its shapes adopted later for the Phoenicians and the Greek alphabet evolved from hieroglyphics, so they're giving us some credit. But the Egyptians mixed ideas and pictures and words spelled out with sounds and symbols, and they never made the jump to an alphabet. And they kind of emphasized that the Egyptians never made a jump to an alphabet. Would you comment on this?
Okay, now it is very important to understand who the Phoenicians are. Okay, the Phoenicians initially, according to Diop, were black. Later they became Semitized, so that you have both black Phoenicians as well as mixed Phoenicians. The role of the Phoenicians, you see, 50% of the export-import trade of the Egyptians were by Phoenicians, who were they were not a race of people. There were all sorts of people who were involved in trade, in navigation particularly. And you find that everything that the Egyptians did, the Phoenicians would carry it to other people. If the Egyptians decided to use purple as the color of royalty, the Phoenicians carried it down the Mediterranean. If the Phoenicians decided to use this symbol for a head, the Phoenicians carried it down the Mediterranean. If the Phoenicians built a new warship, the Phoenicians would study the warship and they would make slight innovation and they would carry it down the Mediterranean. If the Egyptians decided to wear a shoe with a little hoop up at the top, the Phoenicians would take the shoe down the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians therefore were carriers, as they say. They were carriers. Okay, so that the hieroglyphs were carried by the Phoenicians, and as they entered other places, people started to play around with them. So that you get the development of an alphabet, because you see the hieroglyphics, even though part of it is alphabetical, part of it is pictorial. Okay, so that you have a later development into alphabet where you could squeeze it down into very few symbols. Okay, the Japanese, for example, are far behind us in that. That has nothing to do with intelligence, because nobody could question Japanese intelligence, but the Japanese have an alphabet that would literally blow you away. It would take months to learn their alphabet because it doesn't have 26 signs. It has hundreds and hundreds of signs. So that you can have signs and symbols, part of which are pictorial, before eventually you have that kind of alphabetic thing. Different African peoples had alphabets, like the Akan developed an alphabet. The Mande developed an alphabet with 200 and something signs. The 140 to 150 signs in Akan, etc. The Egyptian thing, however, as I say, the Phoenician thing was a carrier, but the reason why they want to place it all in the Phoenician now is because the Phoenician to them is Semitic. Remember, those are Semitic. That's a Semitic study going on. Okay? They don't want the Egyptian, they're not going to tell you, well, but these signs began with Egyptian. You know, that is in passing. They're going to try and show you the Greek got this fantastic abstraction, and the Phoenician, the clever Phoenician. Where are the Phoenician books? Where are their books? The word biblos, book, comes from Phoenician. And why do you think the word book comes from Phoenician? They had the material that made books, but they never wrote books.
This brother here, the sister there, and the brother over there.
Yes.
We'll have to close it out.
Okay, go ahead.
We've had certain black leaders been on radio stations attacking other black leaders. I'd like to know what effect you think that has on the black movement.
I am a historian, okay? You could deal with your politics with other people. I don't have anything to say about that. That's a normal thing in politics. People attack other people. Okay, go ahead. The Dravidians and the who? No. Dalit is a modern, the modern untouchable movement. One section of them, a great section of them, have called themselves Dalits. Okay, but they're not Dravidian. Okay, Dravidian is a type. You see, the African has a lot of varieties. First, you had a very small type, almost like a dwarf, who went to China and various other places. Then you have a type following that small type, a larger bone type of African coming into, and some of them have wavy hair. Those are the Dravidian types. Yeah, I'm sorry that we may not have time for slides tonight because we're running out of time. But the Dravidian is not related to that. Okay. Yes, the Dravidian is an Afro-Asiatic, and the early Dravidians are Africoid. They also developed a script known as Dravidian script, which was used in the Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro cities, or rather civilization. Yes. Jesus is first represented on a coin that was struck in the 2nd century AD. On the one side is a European, that is the king, the Emperor Justinian II. On the other side is a man with woolly hair and brown skin. His nose is Semitic. They're leading us to the conclusion that he's a mixed man with black and Semite. Okay. One more question. Yes. I don't know much about, as much as most people do, about the slave trade. I know that the first slaves, and this is a lot people don't know about, that the first people in America who were turned into slaves were 6 Native American Indians whom Columbus captured and brought back to Spain at the end of his first voyage. He actually initiated slavery. I wish I could have said that in Congress, but that would be too much. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay, the best essay that has been done in this, concise essay, is done in this book, African Presence in Early Europe, which deals with the evolution of the Caucasoid. Okay, and it really deals with how the black went into Europe and how the Ice Age came, what is known as the worm interstadial, and how the blacks were trapped in the ice, and that after a long period locked away from the sun with tangential sunlight, you have dropping of pigmentation. Because you see, in sunlight, the pigmentation, we're not talking about the temperate zone as it is today, because this is a zone that is changing. In the next 75 years, according to scientists, it will become disadvantageous to have pink skin, because the hole in the ozone layer is bringing back into this, on the side of the planet which is now called the temperate zone, ultraviolet radiation is increasing. Hence, pigmentation once again will become an ecological necessity. Okay, so that those are changing situations, but in this specific time in which the blacks who were trapped in Europe underwent pigmentation change, is a period that lasted 10,000 years. It's not overnight phenomenon. It's not a passing phenomenon. That became a very cold zone of the earth. Okay, so that you have not only pigmentation change, you have hair change, because in heat you have a tendency to have scant hair because it's supposed to you're supposed to throw off the heat. In cold, you have a tendency to your hair has a tendency to grow longer because it has to protect you from the cold. So that you will have also you have different kinds of drynesses and wetnesses in these ecological zones. So you'd have the hair follicles will grow differently. Those are superficial things. And because the Aryans, who were not as developed as the Africans, struck African capitals and defeated them in many places, the Aryan then began to set up what is the aesthetic, what you should look like, what you should do, and things like that. So that you have these problems. Their religion came from outside. The Christian thing, the Muslim thing, and so forth, those are things that came out of an elder people, the Africans. But the thing is that they set up a system, okay, and the problem that we have is that we begin to see in that system. Our eyes, even in spite of even all our protests, our eyes see things in that system, okay. But what science has established is that those are very superficial, irrelevant indices of humanity. What is significant is the organic structure and the brain structure, which is Africa. That is what science has established, that anatomically we are all Africans, because the brain was developed in Africa. At the final stage, all stages of the brain, right up to the stage at which it now occupies on this planet, was developed in Africa. The breakaway, or rather speciation, it's not speciation really, it's mutation, because you don't have different species in man. The mutation occurred on the special conditions. Okay, we must break now. Thank you.
Thank you.